In the year 1871, the Caradon estate rose from the heathered hills of the Scottish Highlands like something built not with stone but silence. The manor stretched wide and gray, its windows unblinking, its chimneys tall enough to speak to God if anyone inside believed in him. It had stood for 5 generations, owned and passed down by women alone. Caradon women who bore other Caradon women who buried their husbands without naming them aloud. The matriarch, Euphemia Caradon, ruled the house with a voice that seldom lifted above a whisper and a gaze that made men feel like schoolboys who'd spoken out of turn. She walked the halls with an ivory cane that never touched the floor. The sound of her presence was not a tap but a hush, and wherever she went, stillness followed. Visitors to the estate were rare, and when they came, land agents, bishops, officials, they left quickly, clutching papers too blank, nodding too often. The land around the manor was fertile in a way that defied reason. Crops flourished here during seasons of blight, cattle bore twins, wool grew thick and white like snowbanks. The locals whispered about the Caradon soil, said it remembered everything and that it gave back only to those who fed it well. Euphemia's name was never spoken in taverns or churches. When her carriage rolled past the village, no one waved, and when she visited the chapel, no one sat in the pew behind her. Inside the manor, the ancestral hall stretched 2 stories tall and displayed exactly 40 portraits. All were of daughters. They hung in strict descending order, painted in oil with eyes too old for the soft lace at their throats. Euphemia's own portrait stood at the end, unfinished. The painter had stopped at her hands, unsure how to capture fingers that had never once trembled. No male likeness had ever adorned the wall. No husband, no brother, no uncle, no cousin, no son. Caradon girls are born of Caradon's soil, Euphemia said once to a solicitor. That was all. No further questions were asked. And yet the nursery told another story. It had 16 cribs arranged in a perfect circle. 16 identical canopies, 16 feeding basins, a mobile above the center that spun on its own long after the windows were sealed shut. No one had entered the nursery in years. The servants said the room cleaned itself, no dust, no cobwebs, no footprints, just the smell of powder, sweet and sharp, like milk turned just slightly wrong. The local registrar's office listed only female births for the Caradon line, spanning from 1793 to the present. Every daughter was accounted for. The records were clean, too clean. Midwives recalled being paid in advance, then never summoned. Doctors were turned away at the gates with envelopes of coin and a pressed sprig of yew. Some said it wasn't until the 3rd daughter that the doctor was allowed inside. Others said no man had stepped into the birthing wing in over 100 years. And yet the manor had once echoed with cries, brief and low, quickly cut short. Servants who had worked the estate in their youth remembered hearing sounds that didn't match the faces in the dining hall. There was a birth bell kept in the chapel, a rusted iron thing once used to summon help for women in labor. It hadn't rung in decades, yet it had never been removed. Euphemia called it sacred. The bell bore a single inscription along the rim, "For those who leave before they're named." That line wasn't from scripture. No priest recognized it. It was Caradon scripture written into their blood, repeated in the hushes between lullabies. One former maid, speaking long after she'd escaped to Inverness, claimed she once saw Euphemia walk into the nursery alone and emerge holding a cloth-wrapped bundle that didn't cry. She wasn't asked to return the next morning. Her final pay was slipped into her apron while she slept. The estate ledger tracked livestock, crop yields, and births. Every daughter had an entry, their weights, their conditions, the hour they emerged. But 16 times over 40 years there were pages left blank, titled only "Born of Caradon Soil," with no name, no measurements, no remarks. Just the date and a faint brown fingerprint. Euphemia never explained those entries. She never needed to. Her quiet authority filled in the blanks, and over time even the servants stopped wondering. It was easier to think of the estate as a house for girls only. Simpler to believe no boy had ever set foot on those polished floors. No cradle had ever swung with the weight of a different kind of cry. But the soil said otherwise. It shifted, it heaved. Some nights it opened. The groundskeeper, a mute man named Fallon, was once seen digging near the orchard with no tools, just his hands. He carried nothing back inside, but he didn't sleep that night. He sat by the chapel until morning, his face ash-gray, his nails cracked and filled with what looked like thread. Euphemia never asked what he'd found. The next day the orchard was burned. They said it was an accident. The fire stopped exactly where the nursery walls began. In 1871, Euphemia was 76 years old. She had outlived her daughters' daughters, and most of the village. She slept in the west wing now, closest to the nursery. She spoke less, ate less, walked less. But every morning she had her cane polished. Not because she needed it, but because the sight of it in her hand made the house hold its breath. She had once said that a woman need not speak if her silence is made sacred. And in Caradon House, silence was not the absence of sound. It was a rule, a warning, a form of inheritance. No one ever asked why the house needed 16 cribs for a lineage of daughters. No one asked why the portrait stopped above the nursery door. No one asked why the soil behind the stables had never grown grass. Because Caradon girls are born of Caradon soil. And what the soil takes, it does not return, not in name, not in bone, not even in memory. But the house remembers. The house always remembers. In the spring of 1853, the Caradon estate swelled with life in ways the neighboring villages could no longer understand. Where their own fields withered under frost and famine, the Caradon crops grew fat and gold, bending at the stalk like they carried secrets instead of seeds. The cows birthed calves with no stillness in them. The orchard trees wept pears so ripe they split in the hand, and the rain came only when it was wanted. The villagers spoke less and watched more. They said the land had been paid for, not bought, and if you asked what had been paid, no one looked you in the eye. Those who remembered the old rites turned their faces from the wind when it passed over the manor fields. They said it carried breath not meant for ears. But the records were clean, the fields were fertile, and the Caradons were always women. Only women, always. Beneath the manor's upper chapel, sealed behind an iron latch and a veil of dust, Sister Katrina had once knelt in prayer so long her knees bled into the stone. She had served the Caradon line as midwife and confidant for 31 years. Her habit had been stitched from cloth sent by Rome. But the church that bore her name was not recognized by any known diocese. She called it the Church of the Veiled Hour, where time stilled for birth and death, but not the life between. She kept no congregation, only rituals. Her voice was heard only during labor and only then in song. The Karadan women obeyed her without flinching, and Euphemia obeyed most of all. It was Sister Katrina who first wrote the words, "Boys born under the Karadan moon return to the earth they defied." The words appeared not in her journals, which were carefully inscribed and burned annually, but in a single torn letter hidden between pages of dried mint. The ink bled in the corners. The paper was scorched, as if it had almost been destroyed. The letter, written to no one, recorded a ceremony Euphemia had called the Covenant of Earth. In it, Sister Katrina described a rite in which a mother-to-be walked barefoot into the field under the waxing moon, reciting each daughter's name aloud, followed by the silence of the sons never named. If her voice trembled, she was denied delivery. If she cried, she was bound. No boy born in the house was ever held for long. No one kissed their foreheads. No lullabies were written for them. The letter continued, saying that soil remembers debt and blood makes the balance. The land, it claimed, had been promised sons in exchange for bounty. Not just any sons, but Karadan sons, firstborns, silentborns, ashborns. They were not sacrificed, the letter argued, but fulfilled. Euphemia believed that sons drained lineage, that only women could preserve the Karadan name, and that to allow a male child to live would infect the house with disobedience and decay. She called it soil, loyalty, a form of sacred accounting. Every harvest bore proof that the vow had been kept. Sister Katrina detailed how no stillborn male child was placed in a coffin. Instead, the bodies were wrapped in wool soaked with mother's milk, blessed with iron salt, and placed into shallow trenches around the orchard. The trees grew fastest there. The fruit bloomed early, and the roots always curved inwards. One entry described Euphemia's second labor. A boy, breeched, breathless. The child made no sound, and yet Euphemia insisted she heard a hum in the nursery walls. Sister Katrina obeyed. The baby's body was cold before it fully crowned. Euphemia refused to look. She only asked for fresh linen and a moment alone with the soil. That night, a storm passed over the manor, split a nearby elm, and washed the ash from the courtyard's stone well. In its basin were fingernail-sized teeth, milk-white and ancient. They were not from this birth. They had been waiting. No one in the village had ever attended a Karadan funeral for a child. No tombstones, no memorials, no candles burned in the chapel. The family claimed exceptional health, as if death didn't visit their line. And yet the nursemaids whispered of shallow graves in the apple rows and the scent of clove before each harvest. Euphemia was said to keep a ledger, not of births or deaths, but of offerings. It was not a book, but a circle carved into her bedroom floor. Each year she added a symbol to its edge, small, deliberate, pressed into stone with an iron dowel. Sister Katrina watched her once, then never again. She said the symbols resembled the scrawls of a tongue before it learns to speak. The prosperity of Karadan land brought attention. Ministers came, surveyors visited, but the air around the manor was too still, and Euphemia too clever. The stillbirths were not listed. The death records had gaps filled with girls. One official noted an inconsistency in 1847, 2 births on the same day but only 1 child present the following spring. Euphemia explained it away with quiet dignity. The official never wrote again. Sister Katrina later recorded that same year as the year of 4 roots. No context, just 4 curved lines etched beside the margin. The Church of the Veiled Hour was eventually struck from all diocesan ledgers. It was deemed heretical, its remaining members defrocked or disappeared. But Sister Katrina remained on Caradan land until her death. She was not buried but absorbed, her body never found, her letters burned, except one. The torn page, the vow, the truth, that the Caradan soil was sacred because it had been fed, that silence was not peace but price, and that for every bloom that graced the fields a boy had first been planted beneath it. The land stayed green long after her voice was gone, and the vow once whispered in candlelight now lived in the roots. The Caradan women continued on, widowed, childless, matron saints of a name that refused to rot. The soil kept their secret. But the wind had started to carry it, just faintly, just enough, for someone someday to hear. In the autumn of 1867, the hills around the Caradan estate were quiet with rot. Trees bore their last apples in silence. Their bark cracked as if the orchard itself had been listening too long. At the far end of the valley, in a village without a name on any modern map, a man named John Etheridge prepared for his last inspection. He was not a large man, nor brave, but he was precise. A school inspector by trade, he traveled with his boots polished and his pencils sharpened, and he believed that truth once recorded became unshakable. His appointment at the Caradan estate had been delayed twice by the matriarch. When she finally permitted his visit, it came with a note. 1 hour, no personal inquiries. Observe the children, nothing else. He arrived at Caradan just after sunrise, escorted not to the grand entrance but to a side door used for servants. There was no formal greeting, no hand to shake. A girl in a blue frock answered and led him through a maze of corridors that narrowed the farther they went. The air inside the house was dry and soft, like a place where the air refused to echo. No laughter, no footsteps, just the hum of absence. He was brought to a sitting room with lace-covered chairs and was told the girls would be brought to him shortly. But Etheridge, curious and methodical, had already marked something wrong in his notebook before they arrived. There was no noise above them, no footsteps from the nursery, no sound of a governess or the faint rattle of toys. When he asked where the children slept, the girl tilted her head and said they stayed downstairs now. She did not say why. She did not offer an explanation. She merely said the upper nursery had been closed for some time, that the fire had made it unsafe. But when Etheridge asked what fire, she only blinked. And when he pressed further, the girl excused herself and returned with the housemaid, who explained softly that the room was sealed and always had been, that the inspector need not trouble himself with ashes and rafters, that the children were learning and that was all that mattered. But Etheridge, for all his mildness, had a habit of following unasked questions. When the girls were brought in, 6 of them, all dressed alike, each with the same ribbon tied in the same place, he made his notes quietly. Their eyes did not wander. Their posture was perfect. Their speech was careful, too careful, like language had been boiled and measured before it touched their tongues. After the lesson, instead of leaving, he asked to see the nursery. He did not wait for permission. He followed the staircase up past a curtain of dust and found the heavy nursery door barred with an iron latch. It had not been opened in years, but the key still hung from a hook nearby, polished and warm as if recently touched. Inside, the air was still. The room smelled of old powder, iron, and something bitter he could not name. The cribs were intact but stripped of bedding. The mobile in the center hung motionless, but the chain that held it was stained black. Above, near the ceiling beams, 3 iron hooks jutted out from the wood, thick and low, far too strong to hold anything as light as decoration. He moved to the fireplace and found the chimney grate filled with fine, dark ash. No soot around the edges, no logs, just ash. As if something had been burned not to warm the room but to end it. Etheridge did not report what he found that day. He left the manor without confrontation. He smiled as he thanked the housemaid. He tipped his hat to the girl in the blue frock. He waved to no one as he passed through the gates, but when he returned home he wrote, "Not for the board, not for the school commission, but for himself." In his private journal, hidden behind his wife's music books, he sketched what he remembered: a crib, the hooks, the chimney, a bundle wrapped in burnt cloth, small as an infant, with no eyes on the face, no lids, just smooth skin stretched tight. The drawing was not labeled. The entry ended with the sentence, "They do not sleep. They are silenced." 2 weeks later, Etheridge's wife found the front door open at dawn. The well behind their cottage was full again after months of drought. His hat lay beside it, soaked. His boots were on the grass, upright and paired. When they pulled him from the water, his eyes were open. There were scratch marks along the inside walls of the well, long and deliberate, as if he had not fought but reached. His death was ruled an accident. Grief, perhaps, or exhaustion. But in the years that followed, his wife never slept without a lamp lit, and his daughter, grown and widowed, once claimed that when she opened his trunk in the attic, the pages of his journal stuck together, as if they had been soaked in milk and left to dry. She found the drawing pressed between 2 letters. She never showed it to her own children, but she kept it, wrapped it in linen, hid it beneath the floorboards of her own nursery, not out of curiosity but fear. She said the eyes weren't missing. They had never been meant to form, as if the child had been born with nothing left to see, as if someone had promised it would never look upon the world that burned it. The Carradine estate made no statement. The children remained enrolled. The nursery door stayed sealed. The chimney grate filled itself again each winter, and the ash never grew cold. In the summer of 1872, when the ground was too dry for seed and the stables sagged beneath their own rot, the Carradine Matriarch ordered a trench dug near the east paddock. It was meant to redirect runoff from the spring thaw, something to keep the lower fields from drowning like they had the year before. Euphemia made the request with her usual cool calm, noting the dimensions in ink without consulting her groundskeeper. She said the trench should be shallow, 6 feet, no deeper. Her voice lingered longer than her footsteps, and when she turned from the porch, not one of the house staff dared meet her eyes. By morning, the young gardener assigned the task, a mute boy named Ellis, began carving into the earth with a bent spade and a hollow stare. He didn't question. He didn't hesitate. He dug. The soil near the stables was loose and wrong, dry but not brittle, damp underneath but not with rain. As Ellis drove his spade into the 4th foot of the trench, the earth gave way too easily, folding open like it had been touched before. The metal struck something soft first, then something that cracked like dry twigs. He paused. He crouched, and when he pulled the burlap from the shallow curve in the dirt, he did not scream. He simply stood. He walked back to the manor, and he handed the bundle to the woman scrubbing the chapel steps, as if offering nothing more than a clump of weeds. Bridget O'Loughlin was the only servant who had stayed longer than 2 seasons. Irish-born, raised in the folds of famine and loss, she had never once flinched at the oddness of the Caradan household. But when the fabric peeled back from the edge of the bundle and she saw the bone, 4 of them, each curved and pale, femurs no longer than her own hand snapped cleanly at the knee, she fell back against the chapel wall and did not rise. She sat shaking, her apron smeared with soil and something darker that smelled like copper and milk. She began to weep, then sob, then scream. She ran through the house, shrieking about boys with broken voices, their mouths torn open but unable to speak. She said she'd seen their hands twitching beneath the soil, their chests rising like they wanted to be born again. She tore her own nails across her cheeks, repeating the phrase, "Not foxes, not foxes, not foxes," until her throat bled. The younger girls were pulled away. The housemaids locked the nursery, though no child had slept there in years. And Euphemia came down from her private study in silence, holding a vial of rose water and the linen handkerchief she always used for stains she didn't wish to name. Bridget was taken to the chapel and left there overnight. The next morning she was gone. The asylum records from Duncarrow Sanatorium show that a woman named Bridget O'Loughlin was admitted without family, identified only by a note bearing Euphemia's seal. She was placed in isolation after attempting to claw through the floorboards with her bare hands. The doctors marked her delusion as persistent and florid, convinced, they wrote, that male children had been buried alive beneath a manor house, and that their whispers now lived in the mortar. She refused food unless it was blessed. She would only sleep if a hymnal was left open at the foot of her bed. She refused to speak the name Caradan after the first month. She called it a place where God had never looked. Back at the manor, Euphemia addressed the household staff only once. She explained the bones as remnants of a fox den. She said small creatures often stole bits from the cemetery and that wild dogs had dug through the soil seeking shelter. She burned the burlap in the chapel hearth. She had the trench filled in. She salted the ground. And from that day forward, no one was allowed to dig near the stables without her express permission. But rumors persisted. The housemaids whispered that the bones had been tied together with silk ribbon, that one of them had a notch carved into its side, shaped like a crescent moon, that the cloth had smelled not of earth, but of burnt milk and old lilac, like the kind Euphemia always kept in the nursery cabinets. They said the fox story was older than even the orchard trees, repeated every time the soil gave something back that wasn't supposed to return. The orchard after that summer bore no fruit. The trees blistered, the roots pushed up from the earth as if rejecting what they once fed on. Servants came and left quickly. New ones were told never to ask about Bridget. The girls of the house, the newest generation, were moved to the west wing and kept from the chapel altogether. No marker was placed for the bones, no priest was called, no rites were given. And yet, from that year onward, the stables grew colder in spring, even when the sun pressed hard against the glass. Horses refused to enter. The dogs howled once and never again. And still Euphemia walked each morning past the filled-in trench, her cane striking softly against the stones. Her steps never faltered, her eyes never dropped. She passed that place the way a woman passes a mirror she chooses not to look into, not because she's afraid, but because she already knows what's there. In the archives beneath St. Enda's in Aberfeldy, hidden behind a false wall that held nothing but cracked hymnals and discarded chalice cloths, a priest named Father Lyle discovered the sealed confessional transcript in the winter of 1908. It had no official stamp, no envelope, no signature, just a wax seal bearing the emblem of a long-forgotten sect, the Church of the Veiled Hour. The seal had nearly dissolved into the parchment, as if the paper itself had absorbed it like blood. When he opened it, the first page was nearly blank, save for one sentence written in a slanted hand. "This is not a sin, but a trade." What followed were 47 pages of testimony recorded in 1849 describing a rite practiced for generations on the Caradon estate. The name was written carefully over and over again, not just as a place but as a threshold. The ritual was called the Offering of St. Agnes, though no known Catholic scripture ever included such a rite. The Church of the Veiled Hour, formally denounced by Rome in 1831, had built its theology around the silence between birth and death, the unspoken covenant that claimed the firstborn male of a house in exchange for the continuation of its name through daughters. According to the transcript, the blood of a son born to a Caradon mother was not viewed as holy but as obstructive, a blockage, a taint. The sect believed feminine inheritance carried clarity, purity, and loyalty to land and legacy. Male offspring disrupted this channel. They were seen not as blessings but as bruises. If allowed to live, the house would rot, the crops would fail, the names would wither on the tongue. The ritual itself, as described in the transcript, required that each Caradon woman, upon the birth of her first son, walk barefoot through the orchard under the new moon. She was to carry the child in silence, wrapped in cloth soaked with mother's milk and rosewater. At the edge of the southern slope, where the soil turned black with ash from the old hearth fires, she would place the child face down in the shallow earth and recite the vow of silence. The prayer was short, just 7 words. Soil, keep him. Soil, forgive her. Soil, remember. The mother then had to smear a line of her own blood along the child's spine before covering him with exactly 13 handfuls of dirt, no more, no less. If she failed to finish before the first night bird cried, she was to be excommunicated from the house and the name. There was no second chance. The confession that described this rite was made by a woman known only as Sister Elise. Her voice, written down by the pen of a reluctant priest, trembled even on the page. She claimed to have assisted in 17 such rituals during her time at the Caradon estate. She said each boy was born already spoken for, that their eyes opened too early, that their cries came out in reverse like breath returning to the womb. She said some mothers hesitated, but none refused. Not once, because to refuse meant the orchard would never bear again. It meant the name would be whispered by strangers. It meant the soil would no longer protect them. Elise wrote that Euphemia herself once carried a son to the ash line, years before the rites were officially banned. That she had not waited for the moon but insisted the soil would understand urgency. That the child had not cried, but had bitten through his own tongue. that the silence once he was gone was so complete it made the windows hum. Historical records confirm that the Church of the Veiled Hour was condemned as heretical after it was linked to 12 cases of infanticide across 3 counties. But none of the Caradine women were ever charged. No remains were recovered. No witnesses ever came forward. The sect itself faded into rumor, absorbed into other names, or burned out entirely. And yet the rites, according to the transcript, had become domestic tradition by the time of Sister Elise's confession. She claimed the church didn't end the ritual. It simply let the women take ownership of it. The altar was now the field, the priestess now the mother, the blessing now the silence that followed. In the margins of the transcript, the archivist who catalogued it decades later scrawled a note in red ink. If false, this is madness. If true, it is something else entirely. The file was placed in a sealed box labeled Non-Canon Confessionals, not to be released without Vatican approval. It never was. But copies were made, quietly. One found its way into the hands of a historian researching hereditary madness in Scottish noble lines. Another disappeared into the personal library of a midwife who claimed to dream of voices calling from underneath apple trees. One surfaced briefly in an estate auction misfiled among gardening records. It vanished before bidding began. What remains undeniable is that Caradine wealth surged in direct proportion to the rise in female-only births across its lineage. Every decade brought daughters, and with them expansion, new land, new titles, new protections. The estate flourished when others starved. The orchard bore even when disease choked the countryside. The fields grew in exact obedience. But beneath it all, the soil bore something else, something carefully planted, carefully silenced, carefully kept. And when the orchard wind blew against the house in autumn, the servants said it carried more than leaves, that it sometimes sounded like breath, sometimes like names, sometimes like boys who had never learned to speak. Dr. Percival Rowntree had once been considered a man of rare gentleness. He wore his spectacles low and his collars higher than most. His hands were soft, clean, unhurried. In public, he was the kind of physician mothers trusted. He listened without interrupting, never raised his voice, and carried the faint smell of linseed and lavender from the salves he made himself. He served the Caradine estate for 32 years, attended all births, signed all certificates, and in the eyes of the parish his word was gospel. But in his study, in the third drawer beneath the window where no sun ever landed, he kept a book that had no title, no leather spine, just paper stitched together by twine, stained at the corners and swollen with ink that smelled faintly of milk. His anatomy log, private and unspoken, did not list illnesses. It listed patterns. The first entry came in 1836, 2 decades before the orchard bore its heaviest fruit. A boy unnamed, born at first light. The note reads simply, "Vital signs present. Removed within 10 minutes, no cry. Cream film around lips, no evidence of illness. Skin still warm, no signature, no measurements, no mother listed." But beside the page, a small folded slip, a sketch of a square of cloth marked with a faint emblem, the Caradine crest, stitched in pale thread, near invisible unless turned toward light. The cloth, described in later pages, became known only as the whitening cloth. Rowntree never called it a murder weapon. He called it an instrument, a tool for silence. The next pages grow darker. Boys born in winter and heat and storm, all still, all silent. Rountree's writing shifts from medical observation to ritual pattern. He begins noting the position of the cloth on the face, always angled downward, pressed over mouth and nose, often held with such precision that no bruising occurred. He writes that the tongue of each child was discovered bitten through, not by force but by reflex, as if the child sensed something final in the air and tried to taste their own ending before it arrived. One entry reads, "Smothered soft, tongue bitten, cream still warm on lips, body limp but heart resisting, removed at third breath." The words are clinical, cold, but behind them something moves. There is a drawing later in the log, a face of a newborn, not screaming, not even crying, but tense, lips slightly parted, eyes closed. The fabric pressed against the features shows the Caridin seal in full. It is not a baby blanket, it is not cotton. Rowntree notes it is made from pressed flax woven with lamb's wool, soaked in milk until stiff, then dried under moonlight. The cloth was not intended to warm, it was meant to hush. And he repeats one phrase beneath every image: to prevent infection of rebellion. Rebellion, in Rowntree's understanding, was not a political act. It was a cry, a rupture in the quiet lineage Euphemia demanded. A son's first scream, if allowed, could undo the pattern, could pull the soil upward, could stain the daughters. He wrote that Euphemia once told him gently that boys born into Caridin were born already unwelcome, and that kindness was to stop them before they fully arrived. That the cloth was not punishment but preservation. That a girl could inherit silence, but a boy would only fracture it. The physician had come to believe this, or at least stopped doubting it. As the years passed, his log transformed from record to scripture. He categorized the whitening cloth as a necessary medical implement. He documented its placement, its effect on breath rhythm, the exact time between last heartbeat and skin pallor. He noted that the cream around the mouth was always fresh, that the mothers, even when pale and trembling, never asked to hold their sons again. They understood. Euphemia made sure of it. In one disturbing passage, Rowntree describes assisting in a birth where the mother hesitated. She asked to name him, just once, a whisper, a syllable half-formed. Euphemia intervened. She asked for the cloth. Rowntree handed it to her. He did not question. He writes that the child's chest rose 3 times, that Euphemia counted each aloud, that she pressed the cloth gently, slowly, as though quieting a wind. When it was done, the mother was told she had dreamed it, that it had been a pain illusion, that no boy had come, only emptiness swiftly handled. By 1869, the log had grown to 72 entries, none acknowledged by law, none reported. Every page ended with a signature, a small curved mark, not Rowntree's full name but a crescent, Euphemia's personal symbol. She had approved each one. Rowntree died in 1873. His official obituary listed him as a man of grace, reason, and compassion. It mentioned his dedication to the Caridin women and his tireless work on maternal health. His burial was modest. His journals were never mentioned. But years later, during repairs to his former home, a carpenter pried up the floorboards beneath the old study desk. He found a cloth bundle, pale, stiff, folded square. Inside was a final note, unsigned but written in the same hand. The silence was never mine to question. I only made sure it stayed quiet, and beside it the whitening cloth, creased down the middle, still faintly smelling of milk, still bearing the Caridin crest, still folded precisely as if waiting. The bell tower of Caradan Manor stood higher than any chimney, loft, or roofline in the entire valley. From a distance it looked like a watchful eye perched above the estate, narrow and stark, its spire sharp as a blade against the sky. It hadn't been used for signaling in over a generation, but the servants still called it the Matriarch's bell, and no one asked why it rang every night at exactly 2 a.m. No clock wound it, no hand pulled the cord, and when questioned, Euphemia Caradan would only tilt her head and remind the staff that time passed differently in a house with such old roots. Most pretended not to hear it anymore, but some whispered that it wasn't meant for them, that the bell wasn't announcing something, it was keeping something still. In the spring of 1880, a maid named Elsie, barely 17 and newly arrived from Glencoe, grew curious about the tower. She had not yet learned how to quiet her questions, and no one had warned her fast enough. On her third week at the manor, she asked the cook why the bell rang at night with no fire, no visitors, no weather to announce. The cook said the bell was for the soil, not the people, that it was a kind of curfew, that if you heard it once you could go back to sleep, but if you heard it twice you weren't meant to wake up again. Elsie laughed, not unkindly. She had grown up with hunger, not superstition. And when she found the narrow stairwell behind the old linen closet, she assumed it was simply a forgotten passage to an attic or storage loft. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, she just climbed. By dawn, she was found crumpled in the gravel beside the bell tower. Her knees were shattered inward as if she had knelt on stone from a great height. Her fingernails had torn themselves loose, her palms scraped with soot and rust. But it was her eyes that silenced the rest of the staff. They were gone. Not bloodied or cut, just gone, the sockets empty and smooth as though sealed over by something that knew how to erase. She was still breathing when the groundskeeper found her. Barely. Her last words were carried on a breath too thin to be human. She said she saw them, in cages, breathing like birds. And then she was still. The bell did not ring that night. Euphemia made no announcement. She did not attend the burial, though a grave was prepared at the edge of the orchard beside the old stone wall. The priest was never called. No headstone was carved. The name Elsie never appeared again in the payroll records. But the girls born that year, 6 of them, all under the Caradan name, were marked. Each one had a tremor in her right hand, as if something inside her shivered without permission. The cook said it was just nerves. The physician said it was nothing a corset and discipline couldn't solve, but the nursery staff avoided them, said they hummed in their sleep, said one girl woke from a dream speaking a name no one had taught her, a name that made the bell ring again, early this time, at 1:47. Old ledgers show that the bell tower was never listed in the original architectural plans for the estate. It had no maintenance records, no blueprint. But the foundation stones beneath it were ancient, older than the manor itself. Some said the tower had been built on top of a watch point from the wars. Others said it had always been there long before the Caradans arrived, and that Euphemia simply chose to build around it. It was never used for guests. No staff quarters reached that high. The only door that led to the base was locked with a bone key Euphemia kept around her neck. But late at night, when wind shifted across the field, some said you could hear small sounds beneath the bell's echo. Breaths, not screams, just inhaling and exhaling, shallow like birds in a crate, like something alive but forgotten. It was believed the tower stored not bodies but voices, and that Elsie had opened a door not meant to be touched. After her death, no one climbed the stairs again. The linen closet was nailed shut. The staff refused to sleep in the upper levels. Euphemia said nothing. She began wearing darker colors, not black but deep grays, shades close to stone, and every morning after the bell rang, she sat beneath the tower in a chair brought out by the gardener. She would sit for an hour, motionless, looking up but never speaking, as if listening for a sound that only she could hear. Records show no more fatalities linked directly to the tower. But in the decades that followed, more girls were born with silence in their mouths and tremors in their hands. And when asked if they remembered their dreams, some said they saw cages tall and narrow with nothing inside but wind. The bell still rings, never early, never late. And when it does, the house stills and the soil goes quiet. Because in Caradon, the sound is not a warning. It's a ritual, and rituals are not meant to be questioned, only obeyed. In the summer of 1899, the Caradon fields cracked open like old skin. For the first time in living memory, the orchard bore nothing. The wind came hot and mean, lifting the topsoil in strips like scabs peeled from a wound. The river that fed the lower paddocks receded by half, and what little water remained turned green with stillness. Euphemia, now nearly 80 and shrunken beneath her shawls, walked the perimeter of the estate each morning with a tighter grip on her cane and a gaze that searched the horizon for something she refused to name. Her steps had slowed, but her orders had not. She said the land was not angry, it was expectant, that it was waiting for what had been promised. That spring, for the first time in decades, a Caradon son was born. The boy came in silence like the others before him, his skin warm, his breath thin and quick. His mother, a niece brought in from a distant line, was young, shaking, eyes red from too many unanswered questions. She had asked to keep the child, just for the night. She had asked quietly, but not quietly enough. Euphemia entered the birthing room with the whitening cloth already folded in her palm. But before she could speak, the midwife intervened. She said the cloth was no longer needed, that the soil had been too long unfed and the land itself would now claim what it was owed. Euphemia nodded, not in agreement but in command. She said the grave must be dug by moonrise, no hymns, no salt, just soil and silence. The gardener refused. He claimed the ground had gone stiff and brittle, that even the spade resisted entry. Euphemia told him to use his hands. The boy's body was wrapped in lamb's wool soaked in rose water and mother's milk, bound in the same burlap used generations before. He was buried beneath the southern slope, near the oldest tree in the orchard, where the offerings had once made the pears grow heavy enough to snap their branches. The grave was shallow, the dirt poured dry. Euphemia stood beside it with her back straight, muttering a prayer that had not been spoken aloud in half a century. Then the boy was lowered into the earth without a name, as tradition demanded. The maid who carried the bundle wept once, then stopped. Euphemia said grief was not permitted for those who had not spoken. The soil, she insisted, would remember what the living must forget. But the next morning, the tree above the grave turned black at its roots. Its bark split upward, leaving open veins that oozed sap thick as blood. The ground above the burial heaved. not settled but swollen. No foxes came near, no birds circled. The orchard, once noisy with wing and wind, went mute. On the third night, the earth gave the boy back. The grave burst open with no storm, no sound, no shaking. Just a crack across the soil like a mouth opening. The burlap was shredded as though from within. The boy's body lay face up on the ground, eyes open wide and unclouded, mouth parted as if mid-word. His lungs were filled not with blood or rot, but ash, gray powder fine, pressed so deep into the throat that even the physician could not explain it. There was no sign of animal disturbance, no claw marks, no teeth. Just the body, perfectly intact, perfectly placed, as though the soil had changed its mind. The maid, who found him collapsed beside the roots and did not move. When brought indoors, she would not speak. Not for a day, a week, a year, not ever again. She simply stared at the hearth until her eyes dried into glass. The physician bled her twice. Nothing changed. Euphemia said the girl had looked too long into what was not hers to witness. That silence was sometimes punishment, sometimes protection. The orchard rotted from the roots upward. One by one, the trees split and collapsed, even in the absence of wind. The fruit that had not grown fell anyway, soft and unformed, hitting the ground with the sound of flesh. The crops failed. The cows miscarried. The dogs howled once and never again. The land, which had once answered to silence, now replied with refusal. Euphemia ordered the grave resealed, then salted, then burned. But the earth refused each attempt. It remained split, open, watching. As if the grave itself had become a mouth the manor could no longer shut. Later that year, the priest from the next parish came to bless the fields. He was turned away at the gate. It is said that Euphemia, hunched and gaunt, told him the land had never needed God. It only needed remembering. When asked what had happened, she said nothing. She walked to the edge of the field, placed her hand on the cracked soil, and whispered a single word the maid later repeated in her sleep. Ungiven. The boy was never named, never marked, never buried again. His body vanished 2 days later. Some said it was taken by foxes, others said it dissolved. The physician, before resigning, noted only that the ash in his lungs did not match any found in the fireplaces or stoves. It was finer, older, as though pulled from beneath the stone. The soil refused him, and from that year on no more Caradan sons were born, and no more Caradan crops grew. The land had remembered too much, and the silence, once obedient, had learned how to scream. In the spring of 1903, the west fireplace in Caradan's drawing room was scheduled to be torn out and replaced. The chimney had been sealed for decades, and the hearth beneath it remained cold even in winter. When the stones were removed, the workmen found no soot, no ash, no nesting birds, only a hollow cavity bricked shut from the inside. Inside that cavity was a single item, a journal wrapped in burlap, the fabric cracked with age, stitched at the corners with thread the color of bone. There was no title on the cover, no name, just a single phrase written on the first page in hard, narrow letters. Caradan sons, debt paid. The handwriting was Euphemia's. The pages inside were yellowed but preserved, untouched by time or air. Each entry followed the same structure: date, hour, weight, and name. But not the names that marked the nursery. These were different. Names never spoken aloud. Names that never made it past the soil. Thomas, Edgar, Malcolm, Eli, Owen, Nicholas. The list continued. A slow march of lives measured not by years, but by Methods. For each boy, a method was recorded in the final column, written with chilling simplicity. Cloth, rope, burial, milk, cloth, cloth, bell rope, milk, burial, cloth. The repetition dulled nothing. If anything, it sharpened the shape of what had been done. The bluntness of the record made it worse. These were not secrets, these were debts, recorded as if paid in coin. There were 23 entries in total. The first dated back to 1831, the last 1899. The final entry held no time, no weight, just a name scratched so hard into the page that the ink bled through. Abel Carradine. The method refused. The margin beside it bore no explanation, just a note in Euphemia's familiar script. The soil rejected him. I will not try again. At the bottom of that final page, beneath a long pause of blank space, Euphemia had written a single sentence. I only ever had daughters. This was my price, and I paid it. The journal was not a confession. It did not beg for forgiveness. It did not attempt to justify. It simply documented, as if the acts committed had become part of the estate's bookkeeping. As though the cost of wealth was not hidden in vaults or debts, but in bodies that never drew breath past the hour. The phrasing carried no hesitation. Euphemia had never spoken of her sons in public. She denied them in every record. And now, at the end of her life, she preserved them in ink, not as children, but as transactions. The discovery of the journal was never made public. The fireplace was quietly rebuilt. The workmen were dismissed without payment, and the journal was taken to the chapel for storage by the remaining housekeeper, who claimed to have seen Euphemia enter that same fireplace alcove once during a storm, when lightning had struck the orchard tree and the soil beneath it had steamed. She had entered the room alone, stood before the hearth and whispered something into the stones, then left without looking back. Some of the names in the ledger matched those found on no birth certificate, no registry, no church record, and yet the handwriting matched that of midwives long gone. The timestamps were precise, each death listed within the hour of birth, no mother ever signed, no witness ever named, and yet the ink did not smudge. The entries did not falter, as if Euphemia had written each one not in grief, but in practice. In the years following the journal's discovery, strange details began to surface. The nursery mobile, untouched for decades, began to spin slowly each night at 2 a.m., the exact hour the bell once rang. The cradle in the far corner of the sealed room was found with fresh dust disturbed, as if something had rested there in recent days, and the orchard, which had remained dead since the boy Abel's burial and return, began to sprout thin branches along its edge, crooked, twisted, but alive. Not blooming, just reaching. The surviving Carradine women did not speak of the ledger. But one of the daughters, grown and silent, like her mother, was seen once standing at the fireplace with her hand pressed to the stone. When asked what she was doing, she said only that she was listening, that they had never been gone, just buried in ink, waiting to be read. The ledger remains in the manor's archives, locked, untouched, wrapped again in burlap, stitched not with thread but hair, long and dark, belonging to no living servant. Its title has faded. The ink is brittle, but the pages have not aged. Each name remains sharp, each method precise, each son denied and remembered. What Euphemia paid for was not silence, it was memory. And in Carradine, memory never rots. It just waits in stone and cloth and soil, marking its debts one by one. After Euphemia Carradine died in the winter of 1904, the manor sat silent for 3 decades. The fields froze and never thawed. The orchard trees stood hollow, their bark curling like old parchment, their roots dry and curling toward the surface like fingers asking to be seen. By the time the estate was sold in 1936 to a shipping family from Aberdeen, the Carradine name had already been drained from public memory. No heirs, no records, no family tree. The new owners gutted the nursery first, citing cold spots and poor insulation. Then they turned to the north hallway, where the stone felt soft underfoot and the walls hummed faintly when touched. It was behind one of those walls, beneath 3 layers of horsehair plaster, that the first remains were found. Child-sized, curled inward, wrapped in linen stiff with time. They uncovered 7 bodies in total, not buried, hidden, pressed into cavities behind walls and under stairs like forgotten heirlooms. Some had wooden carvings embedded in the chest, symbols etched too cleanly to be accidental. One had a copper bell sealed in its throat, fused with age and heat, as if forged not for sound but silence. No autopsy was recorded, no coroner's name attached. The family left before the year was out. The manor changed hands twice more, then was abandoned for good. Local surveyors filed only vague reports. One called the atmosphere unquiet. Another refused to enter the nursery at all. The walls were left untouched. For decades, the Carradine estate faded again, covered by moss and rumor. The name lost its anchor. But in 1992, an amateur historian named Isla McRae arrived with a satchel of newspaper clippings and her grandfather's old map. She was looking for proof, anything to confirm the stories that had lingered through her family like smoke that wouldn't leave their clothes. On her 3rd afternoon near the edge of the garden wall, she found a child's tooth. Clean, unbroken, wrapped in monogrammed cloth bearing the Carradine seal in pale gold thread. She placed it in her notebook and wrote only 1 sentence beside it. They said there were never any boys. But I found the bones. In 1996, the Scottish Parliament opened a quiet inquiry. No hearings, no press. A single visit. 3 officials. Their final statement classified the Carradine site as a non-historical anomaly, no plaque, no follow-up. The archive box was sealed and marked with a code used for disputed folklore. And still in the village that borders the estate, the whispers returned. They say the soil in the orchard swells when it rains, that the wind near the bell tower sounds like breathing, that the fireplace sometimes glows even though the chimney collapsed 50 years ago. Euphemia was never buried. No headstone, no obituary, only a worn chair left beneath the tower facing the orchard. The land never took her. Maybe it couldn't. Sometimes evil doesn't shout. It whispers in silk gloves and nursery songs. The land remembers. The silence was never empty. What do you think? Could this happen again?